The winter of 1888 came down on the Dakota Plains like a hammer. It was not a gentle slide into dormancy, but a sudden, violent cessation of life. The sky, which for months had been a vast and generous blue, turned to a sheet of hammered lead, low and oppressive. The wind, born in the far, frozen north, arrived without warning, and it did not whisper through the cured grasses, it screamed. It was a physical presence, a relentless bully that shouldered its way through the slightest crack, a thief that stole the breath from your lungs and the heat from your bones. The cold did not knock before it entered. It was already inside. In the small, hopeful settlement of Providence, the cold was the only topic of conversation, the only real currency. The people there were hardy, accustomed to hardship, but this was different. This was a cold that felt ancient and personal, a malevolent intelligence testing the limits of their endurance. They lived in log cabins built from the same shared knowledge, the same time-honored design. The structures were solid, with thick, hand-hewn timbers and mud chinking packed tight against the coming siege. At one end of each cabin stood a stone fireplace, or more recently, a cast-iron stove, its thin metal pipe piercing the roof like a desperate finger pointing at a merciless heaven. These stoves were the hungry gods of every household. They demanded constant tribute. From dawn until long after dusk, men and boys fed them a steady diet of split oak and ash. The stoves glowed a menacing cherry red, a fearsome heat radiating a few feet into the room, creating a small, embattled island of warmth in a sea of biting cold. Step outside that circle, and the cold would find you. The walls of the cabins, for all their thickness, were conduits of misery. On the inside, a delicate, beautiful frost bloomed in intricate patterns, a cold art painted by an invisible hand. Drafts, thin and sharp as a surgeon's knife, sliced through the air. The community struggled as one. The woodpiles, which had seemed mountainous in the golden light of autumn, were shrinking with terrifying speed. The sound of axes biting into frozen wood was a constant, panicked rhythm in the brittle air. Families ate, slept, and lived in a single room, huddled together in a knot of blankets and fear. The children were always coughing. The old looked gaunt, their eyes reflecting the flickering firelight with a weary resignation. They were doing everything they knew how to do, everything their fathers had taught them. But it was not enough. The cold was winning. Amidst this shared and public struggle, there was one woman who was seen as separate from it, not by choice, but by perception. Her name was Ilara, and she was a widow. She had arrived 2 years prior with her husband, who had perished from a fever his first winter, leaving her with 2 small children and a plot of land littered with the glacial debris of a forgotten age. She was from the old country, from a place of steep mountains and deep valleys, where the winters were just as fierce, but the people had made a different kind of peace with them. She was quiet, with a stillness about her that the boisterous, hard-working settlers mistook for frailty or foolishness. She did not engage in the communal complaining about the cold. She simply watched, her gaze distant, as if she were looking at a problem whose solution was already known to her. While her neighbors frantically reinforced their cabins, packing more mud into the chinks and nailing boards over the windows, Ilara did something that baffled them all. She spent the last precious days of autumn not chopping wood, but moving stones. Her land was covered in them, smooth, rounded, heavy fieldstones of all sizes. With the help of her 10-year-old son, she began hauling them, one by one, on a small wooden sledge, to a spot in the center of her small, half-finished cabin. She was not building a fireplace at the end of the room, as any sensible person would. She was building a mountain in the middle of it. The idea had been growing in her mind since the first winter, a memory of her grandfather's house, a house that was always warm, a house that held the summer's heat deep into the winter's cold. It was a principle that defied the local wisdom. Here, heat was a fire you sat next to. It was a thing you made, and that a chimney immediately stole away. Her idea was different. Heat was not something to be made and lost, but something to be captured and stored. She envisioned a massive central core of stone and clay, a thermal battery that would become the warm heart of her home. The fire would burn inside it, but the heat would not be allowed to leave. It would be forced to take a long and winding journey, to surrender its energy into the stone before its ghost was finally permitted to escape. The most respected builder in Providence was a man named Thomas. He was a good man, practical and proud, his hands calloused from a lifetime of shaping wood. He had built nearly half the cabins in the settlement, and he knew what worked. When he saw what Elara was doing, he strode over to her property, his face a mask of concerned disapproval. He found her on her knees, meticulously setting stones in a mortar of clay and sand. A vast, square foundation of rock already filled the center of her floor. "Woman," he said, his voice not unkind but firm, the voice of authority, "what is this foolishness?" Elara looked up, her hands coated in wet clay. She did not flinch from his gaze. "I am building my hearth," she said simply. "Your hearth? In the middle of the room? It will fill the place with smoke. You'll choke those children of yours," he said, gesturing to where her son and daughter were sorting smaller stones by size. "A chimney must go straight up. It needs a clean draw to pull the smoke out. Every fool knows that." "The smoke will go out," she replied, her voice soft but unwavering. "But the heat will stay." Thomas laughed. It was not a cruel laugh, but it was dismissive. The sound of a man who knew his trade encountering utter nonsense. "The heat will stay? In that pile of rock? Elara, that stone will be a block of ice in your house. It will draw every bit of warmth you make right out of the air. You are building yourself a tomb." He shook his head, a gesture of pity. "Let me build you a proper fireplace. At the gable end. It will be done in 2 days." "Thank you, Thomas," she said, turning back to her work. "But my way is the one I know." His rejection, spoken with the weight of community consensus, was the first stone cast. The mockery followed. As the days grew shorter and the air sharper, Elara's folly became a local spectacle. Men would stop by on their way back from the woods, leaning on their axes and watching her slow, methodical work. They saw her laying intricate channels within the growing mass, like a maze for mice. They saw no large, open fireplace, only a small iron door at the base, and another, smaller one for cleaning ash. Most perplexing of all, they saw no provision for a tall, proud chimney pipe. "Where does the smoke go, Elara?" one would call out, a smirk on his face. "She's going to breathe it to keep warm," another would answer, followed by a chorus of rough laughter. The women were no kinder, though their criticism was quieter, spoken in whispers over washing tubs and mending baskets. "Poor thing, her grief has unsettled her mind. Those poor children, it's not safe." They saw her strange design as a rejection of their shared world, a sign that she was not, and never would be, one of them. Her isolation was now complete. She was the strange widow, building her strange house, deaf to the sensible advice of her neighbors. Elara heard the laughter and the whispers. They stung, but they did not stop her. She worked with a quiet, unyielding diligence. Her hands, raw and chapped by the cold and the wet clay, moved with a purpose that bordered on reverence. This was not just construction. It was a ritual, an act of faith. Each stone was chosen with care, fitted into its place, as if it were a piece of a sacred puzzle. She was not just building a heater, she was building a promise to her children, a promise of warmth, a promise of safety. The physical labor was immense. The larger stones required all her strength, leveraged with wooden poles and a prayer. Her son, though young, worked with the grim determination of a man, his small face set in a mask of concentration as he hauled buckets of clay from the creek bed and mixed the mortar with a shovel. They worked from the first gray light of dawn until the purple dusk drove them inside, their muscles screaming in protest, their bodies aching with a weariness that went bone deep. While they labored, they could hear the confident, rhythmic sounds from the rest of the settlement. The ring of axes, the scrape of saws, the cheerful hammering of men who knew exactly what they were doing. In stark contrast to Ilara's slow, patient work, the rest of the community was a flurry of familiar activity. Thomas, as the de facto leader of all things construction, was overseeing the winter preparations for 2 new families that had arrived late in the season. He directed the raising of their cabins with practiced efficiency. The log walls went up in a matter of days, the roof rafters were set, and the stone fireplaces were built at the gable ends, tall and straight, just as they should be. The new families were grateful, praising Thomas for his skill and speed. Their homes looked right. They looked like every other home. They looked safe. Meanwhile, Ilara's structure grew inward as much as upward. The central stone mass became the dominant feature of her small house, a hulking, silent giant. It was 12 feet long, 4 feet wide, and rose nearly to the ceiling. Its surface was a smooth, plastered coat of clay and sand, hiding the complex labyrinth within. To her neighbors, it looked like an altar to some strange, cold god. They saw her finish the roof, and they watched, waiting for the moment she would cut a hole and install a stovepipe. The moment never came. Instead, a small, low stone vent, barely a foot high and capped with a flat rock, emerged near the peak of the roof. It looked absurd, like a mushroom on an oak tree. The final round of laughter was the loudest. Thomas himself shook his head one last time. "She'll learn," he muttered to his wife. "She'll learn the hard way." Inside the cabin, Ilara explained the principle to her son, not with complex words, but with a simple drawing in the dirt floor. She drew the firebox, the small, efficient chamber where a fire would burn fast and hot. From there, she traced the path of the smoke. It did not go up. It went sideways into the first long channel. At the end of the stone mass, it rose to a higher level, then traveled all the way back to the front. Then it dropped to a lower channel, then rose again, snaking its way back and forth, up and down, through the heart of the stone. "The heat," she told him, her finger tracing the convoluted path, "is a tired traveler. We must give it a long road to walk before it can go home to the sky. On its long journey, it lays down to rest in the stone. By the time the smoke leaves, it has given all its warmth to us." Her son nodded, his eyes wide. He didn't understand the physics, but he understood the story. He understood the love and care embedded in every stone. He understood that his mother was building something more than a house. Then the great storm came. It was not a blizzard, it was a war. It began with a sky the color of a fresh bruise and a wind that carried the scent of a frozen eternity. The temperature fell not by degrees, but by tens of degrees. The air became so cold it was brittle, and every sound, the snap of a tree branch, the cry of a distant wolf, was unnervingly sharp and clear. Then the snow began, not as flakes, but as a solid, blinding wall of white moving horizontally across the plains. The world dissolved. There was no land, no sky, only the storm. The wind struck the cabins of Providence like a battering ram. It forced the fine, sharp snow through invisible cracks in the chinking, into the attics, under the doors. It screamed down the straight, open chimneys, driving smoke back into the rooms and stealing the precious heat from the fires. The settlers were trapped. The short journey to the woodpile became a life-threatening expedition. The journey to a neighbor's house was unthinkable. Every family was an island, isolated by a roaring sea of white. Inside the traditional cabins, the failure was swift and absolute. The hungry stoves, now battling the downdrafts from the storm, consumed wood at a demonic pace. The heat they produced was sucked away as quickly as it was generated. The walls, once just cold, were now sheathed in a thick, creeping armor of ice on the inside. Families abandoned all pretense of normal life and huddled directly in front of their stoves, wrapped in every layer they owned, rotating positions like planets around a dying sun. The scorching heat on their faces was a mockery, because their backs were freezing. In Thomas's cabin, the situation was dire. As the most experienced builder, his home was considered the most secure in the settlement, a model of craftsmanship. But the model was failing. His wife and 3 children were huddled together under a mountain of quilts, their breath pluming in the air of their own home. The fire in their stove roared, a desperate, angry sound, but the room grew colder. The walls popped and groaned as the wood contracted in the extreme cold. Thomas stood before the fire, his face grim, feeding it piece after piece of their dwindling wood supply. He was a master of his craft, yet his craft had betrayed him. He had built a fortress of wood, and the cold had passed through it as if it were made of paper. The wind howled with derisive laughter. But inside Alara's folly, there was a different world. When the storm hit, she had done something that would have seemed like madness to her neighbors. She had built a small, hot fire in the firebox of her great stone hearth. For 2 hours, she fed it with dry, seasoned wood, letting it burn as intensely as it could. The iron door of the firebox glowed, and a faint, deep hum resonated from within the stone mass. Then, she had let the fire die out. She closed the flue damper, sealing the heat inside. Now, deep into the second day of the storm, the contrast was absolute. Outside, the blizzard raged, a symphony of chaos. Inside Alara's home, there was a profound and gentle quiet. The wind hammered against the low roof and the thick walls, but it found no purchase. There were no drafts. More importantly, there was warmth. It was not the scorching, localized heat of a stove. It was a pervasive, radiant warmth that filled the entire space, as gentle and steady as summer sunshine. The great stone mass in the center of the room was not hot to the touch. It was just deeply, fundamentally warm, like a living thing. It radiated its stored energy slowly, evenly, into the air, the floor, the ceiling. Her children were not huddled by a fire. They were playing quietly on a rug in the middle of the floor. Later, they slept in their own beds, under a single blanket each, their faces peaceful and rosy. The air was still and sweet. The promise had been kept. The crisis in Thomas's house reached its breaking point on the 3rd night. The last of the firewood was gone. In desperation, he had begun to break up a wooden crate, then a spare chair. The temperature in the room, even a few feet from the dying fire, was now well below freezing. His youngest daughter's coughing had grown worse, a shallow, rattling sound that terrified him. He looked at his wife's face, etched with fear in the flickering firelight, and he knew a terrible choice was at hand. They could stay and freeze, or he could risk the storm and go for help. But where? Everyone was in the same predicament. Everyone was fighting the same losing battle. Then he thought of her, the strange widow, Ilara. He thought of her absurd pile of rocks, her foolish little vent. He had pitied her, laughed at her. He pictured her and her children, frozen in their stone tomb, and a pang of guilt shot through him. He was the community leader, the master builder. He should have forced her to build a proper hearth. Her death would be on his hands. Perhaps, he thought with a surge of desperate hope, She had a little wood to spare. Maybe her folly had been so inefficient it hadn't consumed her supply as fast. It was a sliver of a chance, but it was the only one they had. He wrapped himself in his heaviest coat, pulled his hat down low, and tied a rope around his waist, giving the other end to his wife. "If I am not back in 20 minutes," he said, his voice tight, "pull on this. If there is no wait, God help us." He opened the door and was thrown back by a wall of wind and ice. He lowered his head and plunged into the maelstrom. The 100 yards to Ilara's cabin felt like 100 miles. The wind tore at him, trying to rip him from his feet. The snow was a blinding, suffocating curtain. He navigated by memory, his arms held out in front of him, until his hand struck something solid. The wall of her cabin. He fumbled his way along it, his gloved hands searching for the door. He found it and pounded on it with all his remaining strength, shouting her name against the roar of the storm. He expected no answer. He was ready to break the door down, to find a frozen scene of tragedy. The door opened. Ilara stood there, holding a simple oil lamp. She was not wrapped in blankets. She wore a simple wool dress. Behind her, a wave of impossible warmth washed over him, a gentle, steady heat that felt like a physical embrace. It was the most shocking sensation of his life. He stared past her, his eyes wide with disbelief. The room was bathed in a calm, soft light. Her children were asleep in their beds, breathing easily. There was no roaring fire, no smoke, no frantic activity. There was only peace. He looked at the great stone structure in the center of the room. It seemed to pulse with a quiet, living energy. He reached out a trembling hand and touched its plastered surface. It was warm, a deep, enduring, life-giving warmth. He staggered inside, the cold and the shock overwhelming him. He looked from the peaceful scene to Ilara's calm face. All his pride, all his certainty, all his lifelong knowledge crumbled to dust in that single moment. He was wrong. He had been so profoundly, arrogantly, dangerously wrong. He did not have to say a word. The desperation was carved on his face. Ilara's expression was not one of triumph. There was no hint of, "I told you so," in her eyes. There was only a quiet compassion. She did not boast or explain. She simply acted. "Come," she said, her voice the calmest sound he had ever heard. "Bring your family." The storm raged for another full day, but for Thomas and his family, the war was over. They spent the night huddled not in fear, but in awe, soaking in the gentle, miraculous warmth of Ilara's home. Thomas could not sleep. He sat on a small stool, watching the silent stone monolith, trying to comprehend the principle he had so arrogantly dismissed. He had spent his life building shelters that fought the cold and lost. Ilara had built a shelter that had befriended the heat and won. When the storm finally broke, the world was transformed into a landscape of pristine, sculpted white, beautiful and deadly. The silence was as profound as the storm's fury had been. The first thing Thomas did was go back to his own house. It was a tomb of ice, the air inside colder than the air outside. He returned to Ilara's cabin, the warmth rushing over him again, like a benediction. News of the miracle at Ilara's folly spread as soon as people could dig themselves out. It traveled first as a rumor, a wild tale born of desperation. Thomas, the settlement's most practical man, had taken his family to the widow's house to survive the storm. Impossible. But soon, curiosity overcame disbelief. One by one, then in small groups, the settlers made their way to her cabin. They came to offer help, expecting to find the worst. Instead, they found the impossible. Each visitor had the same reaction. They would push open the door, bracing against the cold they expected to find inside, and stop dead in their tracks, their faces a mixture of confusion and wonder. They were met not with a blast of frigid air, but with a gentle, room-filling warmth. They saw the children playing, Elara mending a sock, the scene one of domestic tranquility that should not exist in this frozen world. Their eyes would inevitably fix on the great stone heart of the house. They would walk over to it, hesitantly, and touch it. The feeling of that deep, radiant heat, coming from an object with no visible fire, was a thing of magic. The laughter was gone, replaced by a stunned, respectful silence. Thomas was the first to break that silence. He approached Elara not as a leader, but as a penitent. He found her outside, calmly sweeping snow from her doorstep. The other men stood back, watching, understanding that this was a moment of profound significance for their community. "Elara," he began, his voice thick with humility. He took off his hat, holding it in his hands. "I was a fool. I was proud, and I was wrong. What you have built here, it is the work of a wisdom I do not possess." He looked at the small, unassuming house, which now seemed to him the grandest piece of architecture he had ever seen. "My family is alive because of you, because you did not listen to me." He paused, gathering his courage. "I ask you," he said, meeting her eyes, "teach me." That simple request, "teach me," was the turning point. It was the sound of pride surrendering to wisdom, of tradition bending to innovation. Elara looked at this strong, proud man, now humbled before her, and she nodded. There was no price, no condition. The knowledge was not hers to own, it was hers to share. She led him inside. With the other men crowding in behind him, she knelt on the floor. She took a piece of charcoal from a small box, and, in the ash near the hearth, she began to draw. She drew the firebox, the winding, serpentine path of the flues, the way the heat was forced to surrender itself to the stone before the smoke was released. She explained it in simple terms, the way she had to her son. She spoke of the fire burning hot and fast, to consume all the fuel and leave no smoke, only heat. She explained how the stone and clay held that heat like a sponge holds water, releasing it slowly over many hours. She held nothing back. She gave them the proper mix of clay and sand for the mortar. She showed them how to shape the channels to ensure a good draw without losing the heat. She explained why the walls of the house should be thick, why the roof should be low. It was a masterclass in survival, delivered not by a boastful inventor, but by a quiet widow who had simply remembered the old ways. The men, who had once leaned on their axes and laughed, now leaned forward, listening with rapt attention, their faces illuminated by the dawning of a new understanding. They were not just learning a new way to build a hearth, they were learning a new way to see the world. That spring, the settlement of Providence was reborn. The sound that filled the air was not the familiar ring of the axe on wood, but the percussive chip of hammers on stone. No one built a cabin the old way. Under Elara's quiet guidance, with a zealous and newly humble Thomas leading the work crews, they began to build new homes and to retrofit their old ones. They tore out the inefficient fireplaces and the hungry iron stoves. In their place, in the center of each home, they raised a great stone hearth. The landscape of the settlement physically changed. The tall, thin stovepipes that had dotted the roofs like lonely sentinels disappeared. The new houses, built on the Elara model, hunkered lower to the ground, their thick walls seeming to grow organically from the earth. They were no longer follies. They were monuments to a shared lesson in humility. The community, once fractured by their mockery of her, was now united in their embrace of her wisdom. They worked together, hauling stone, mixing mortar, sharing the labor and the knowledge. The houses they built were not just warmer, they were stronger, forged from a common purpose and a newfound respect. The story of the widow who stored heat in stone began to travel. A surveyor mapping the territory stayed a night in Thomas's newly retrofitted home and could not stop talking about the incredible, even warmth. A traveling preacher carried the tale to the next valley, describing the strange, chimneyless houses that were the warmest he had ever known. The idea, born of ancient memory and urgent necessity, spread not through patents or newspapers, but through word of mouth, a quiet revolution of common sense passing from one settlement to the next. It became a piece of frontier lore, a testament to the power of a simple, elegant solution. Years passed. The settlement of Providence did not just survive, it thrived. The brutal winters still came, the wind still howled, but the fear was gone. The great stone hearths, the warm hearts of every home, held the cold at bay. The woodpiles lasted the entire winter with ease. The children were no longer sick. Life was no longer a battle for survival, but a thing to be lived. Ilara never sought credit or praise. She remained the quiet woman she had always been, but her status had changed. She was no longer the foolish outsider. She was the wise elder, the respected heart of their community. Her triumph was not in being proven right, but in the quiet, shared warmth that radiated from every home. It was in the faces of the healthy children, in the peace of mind of the families who no longer feared the setting of the winter sun. Her legacy was written not in books, but in the enduring stone and clay of the houses that dotted the valley, each one a silent testament to the simple truth she had remembered, that the greatest strength is often found not in fighting nature, but in understanding it, and that the most profound wisdom often comes from the quietest voice.